Climate Takes, Carbon13's podcast, where we ask our guests for their takes on their industry and the climate emergency, as well as asking what's it going to take to fight the climate emergency. This edition is Climate Takes Critical Materials. This is a huge area in climate tech, and I'm delighted to be joined by Sarah Montgomery, CEO of Infyos.
In your typical battery supply chain, you can have over 10,000 suppliers. They are 10, 20 years ahead of realizing that the world that we've lived in, both from a climate and an air pollution sense, doesn't make sense, but also from an economic sense. Supply chains are the biggest cost to these projects, and therefore one of the key pieces for these projects actually being successful. You ordered something that you thought was going to arrive in 12 months' time, and actually they say, no, it's going to arrive in 18 months' time.
Hello, Sarah. How are you doing today?
Hello. Very good, and very excited to chat more.
Brilliant. Sarah and Infyos actually are from the very first cohort of Carbon13's Venture Build It. You're our OGs launching in COVID. And Infyos is a supply chain data platform for critical materials from batteries and energy storage all the way up to solar and wind. We're going to deep dive into this. Sarah, first off, somebody might hear batteries or energy storage, and they might be thinking AAA or Tesla. When we talk about energy storage, what are you actually working on?
Yeah, for sure. So when they say AAA or Tesla batteries, they are correct in both of those. I guess at its simple form, batteries are just a way to store energy, convert that into electricity when we need it. But there's a bunch of different types of batteries and a bunch of different types of battery chemistries. And so what the battery is that you need in a certain situation depends based on a lot of different variables. So for example, you can look at what is the cost of the battery? What's the cost of the raw materials? What size of battery do we want in this application? What weight of battery do we want? So for example, the reason why we have batteries in cars today, but don't yet really have batteries on planes, is that weight is a big challenge with batteries. And a lot of other variables decide what specific battery makes sense in different applications or doesn't. At Infyos, where we sit, is working with large batteries or large battery applications. So it could be smaller batteries, but being used at wide scale. And so that primarily means that we're working with the businesses that are putting batteries out into the world. And so that mostly means right now we're focused on two core areas. One is renewable energy, which is where we work in batteries, but we were also just touching in solar and wind as well. And then the other side of that is working in automotive EV applications of batteries.
And I think the story that we want to tell when we look at energy storage is just how important it is, not only to nations' industrial strategy, but also to climate tech as well. Why does energy storage matter, Sarah?
Yeah, so I guess to start with the second piece of what you were saying, why it matters on a climate front is that the single most important lever to reduce carbon emissions by 2030 is to triple the global installed capacity of renewable energy. And when you look at the energy sector, that they account for about 73% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so the vast majority. But when you look at, okay, we need to triple renewable energy capacity, what does that really mean? Obviously, the starting point of that was we're going to put a lot of solar into place and we're going to put a lot of wind into place. And then, we're also going to do electric vehicles and so on. But one of the big challenges you have with solar and wind is it's not always windy and it's not always sunny. And so what happens when, it's dark and we need energy is typically you fire up coal power stations, was kind of the old way of doing it. Where batteries come in is, okay, it's super sunny during the day, let's store all this energy into these batteries and then release them when we have a huge demand and it's not still sunny. Or the other challenge is how you balance this load of energy that's needed on the grid. So, for example, if everybody is wanting it at the same time, the grid really struggles with that. And so that's also where batteries can come into play. And so they're essentially just one of these essential pieces of the puzzle for how do we get renewable energy to really work at scale.
And you said by 2030, that's now technically less than 5 years away. This is happening now. This is not early stage prototyping technology. This is large corporates actively building energy storage for nations' energy use. But what do people not realize about the supply chain of critical materials for energy storage and renewables?
I think the biggest thing is probably just how complex these supply chains are. So, in your typical battery supply chain, you can have over 10,000 suppliers sitting across the network from mine material all the way through to the end battery product.
For like one
And
battery.
say that again, sorry?
For like one battery.
Yeah, exactly.
10,000
For
suppliers.
one battery company, not one battery, but one battery company. So, like a Tesla, I think, has about 13,000 suppliers in its network. Obviously, it's got multiple different batteries it's producing at multiple different times of the year, but its whole network that it needs to manage is over 10,000 suppliers. So you have a lot of complexity just in kind of logistical complexity that brings. But then on top of that, when you look at, okay, where are these actual raw materials coming from? You have, 15, more than 15 critical raw materials. You have cobalt coming from the DRC. You have lithium coming from Chile or maybe Australia. You have nickel coming from Indonesia. And all of these different countries is just the starting point of where this raw material is coming from. Then you have the kind of added geopolitical complexity that most of it, about 70% of it, ends up in China. And so we're like very dependent on managing the geopolitical complexity of these supply chains for the renewable energy transition to work.
Got you. So there's a complex supply chain, to say the least, raw materials from all across the globe, which need to circumnavigate the globe several times to end up as a finished project. That's a lot of border checks, different regulatory zones, due diligence. You've got everything from Europe's CBAM all the way down to the prevention of forced labor regulations. Would you say you're saying that the only way to manage that is going to be through data, no?
Yeah, right now it's the classic saying of like you can't manage what you don't know. You can't do anything about what you don't know, right? And most, I would say, like the status quo has been in supply chains, like you obviously know who you're directly buying from. You know, okay, I am setting this order up with this supplier, but you have typically no idea what is the 10,000 player network behind that decides whether or not this is actually a good or a bad supplier.
And that's why they're coming to Infyos.
Yes, that is the core of what we've built at Infyos is AI-powered system that surfaces this data on the supply chain and enables cost-efficient transactions to happen between the supply chain players by surfacing the data that they need for those decisions.
This is complex, but what I love about the team at Infyos is this is not your first rodeo. You are not people who said, okay, we can design software. Let's look for an opportunity in supply chain. You have very unique backgrounds, yourself and your co-founder, Tony. Tell me about it.
Yeah, for sure. So both me and Tony are like self-confessed supply chain nerds is where this all started. Tony, one of his most recent startups was in the coffee supply chain, a startup called Packed Coffee, which on the outside looks like direct to consumer coffee subscription business. But actually behind it, what they built was the tech and operations behind their supply chain back to source. So they knew exactly who their farmers were able to pay them about 140% more than fair trade was paying them. And they could then make their supply chain a lot more efficient by cutting out kind of unnecessary steps and middlemen into their supply chain. And so they scaled that like amazingly. And he has worked in a lot of other supply chain software data plays since then. And then on my side, my world of supply chains where it started was on the diamond supply chain side of things. So most recently was building the China expansion for a diamond supply chain startup. But their diamonds is effectively just one mine material. And we started looking at other mine materials, other industries. And one of them was battery mine materials. And so I realized like, okay, whoa, this is like a huge, messy supply chain and such an important supply chain to get right, especially now, because we're relatively, yes, we're moving very quickly, but we're still relatively early on in the whole transition we need to make for clean energy and mobility. But then the other thing that me and Tony realized was that we both speak Chinese. And in these supply chains, as I was already saying, like 70% of it sits within China. And so if you really want to build any sort of supply chain data platform, you just can't do it unless you figure out how do we access and collaborate with Chinese suppliers. And so surfacing that data, and the data is one of the key pieces, but also building a platform that works in all of these different regions of the world in which these supply chains operate is also a key piece of being able to get that data.
Can I put you on the spot and ask what Mandarin is for Carbon13?
Mandarin for Carbon13. I
Can you do 13?
I can do 13, but I actually don't. I don't know if they will have like a special way of saying what Carbon13 would be, because like carbon is just tan, but Carbon13 tan shu san would be Carbon13. But I feel like we could come up with a better. People would probably misunderstand what we actually mean by that.
What we're actually doing. Maybe there's a word for the isotope.
Yeah.
Yeah, I nearly thought about, look, should we do a climate takes China because it is so important? What would be a difference between the business culture here and the business culture in China?
I think if we look at it from an energy and mobility angle, like China started putting EV policies into place in the early 2000s. Like they are 10, 20 years ahead of realizing that the world that we've lived in, both from a climate and an air pollution sense, doesn't make sense, but also from an economic sense. Like they have been very dependent on parts of the world for fossil fuels that they don't have control over. Whereas like 10, 20 years ago, what they realized is like, we really need to be able to have much more energy security, and the transition to battery, solar, wind allows us to do that. And so they put very aggressive policies into place like over 20 years ago, starting to say, let's get the demand up for battery technology, and also let's support the industry for the supply. But what they didn't just do is like, okay, let's just support a bunch of battery manufacturers. What they said was like, let's look at this entire supply chain from, the manufacturing back to the midstream manufacturing into the refining of these materials, the processing of these materials, and even back to mining, which, for things like rare earths, they have huge local, like Chinese-based supply. But for a lot of the materials, they do not have access in China. So, cobalt, for example, but they have built up these relationships over the last 20 years where they now, I think it's about 80% of cobalt mines are either owned or like part controlled by Chinese companies. And so back to the like, what are they culturally able to do that we haven't yet cracked? I think one is like being able to really take that like system level approach of like, how do we get this energy transition to work at scale? And then obviously they have like a different political system that means that they can coordinate things at a different level to what we can when we live in like, 4-year political cycles. And on top of that, they are very, very ambitious about growth. Like there is so much innovation going on inside these companies. I think it's something like BYD and CATL, which are the two largest battery manufacturers in the world, collectively have close to 50% of global battery manufacturing capacity. Their R&D budget is roughly similar to the whole of Europe's R&D budget combined. So it's just like they're on another planet in terms of like their ambition to be at the forefront of this.
Yes, I recommend our listeners, if you've not come across CATL, a catalog BYD, then I think that's an area to do your research in. And so, would you say, where are you seeing the market growth for Infyos? Where are you seeing the customer growth? Is it in Europe or has it actually been China?
Yeah. So it's both in some ways. So what we are focused on right now is that the deployment of renewable energy in Europe is the fastest that it's ever been in history. And these renewable energy developers are primarily buying from China because that's just where the majority of supply is. It's far more cost competitive than most European US alternatives. But as a result of buying from China, they don't really have understanding of what are the risks associated with buying from China. How do I most cost efficiently enable this transaction with these Chinese suppliers? And that's where we come in and effectively supporting with the data that they need in order to do that supplier selection and management process, but also in order to meet the financing requirements that they have from their investors to be able to have the supply chain risk data and management in place, given that if you do have a supply chain disruption, like you have an example of a big energy player in the US that had a supply chain disruption and a couple of its massive energy projects were no longer financially viable because of the bottlenecks, or they have a 200 million euro cost for a year of project delays that they have related to supply chain bottlenecks. And so all of that means that these renewable energy players that are really aggressively trying to scale up are realizing like supply chains are the biggest cost to these projects, and therefore one of the key pieces for these projects actually being successful.
And I think the geopolitical risks, especially with the raw materials, I'm just seeing in startup land a lot more. We've already had further instability in the DRC, which is where a lot of the cobalt comes from, just in the last couple of weeks, for example, and there's countless other issues. And also what I would say with these really complex supply chains also really struck me is just the delay. Something can break down and cause a bottleneck like a year later.
Yeah. No, 100%. And yeah, if it's, 7 tiers back in the supply chain, there's no way for you to instantly know about it. It has to go down onto the next one, onto the next one, onto the next one. And then, you ordered something that you thought was going to arrive in 12 months' time. And actually they say, no, it's going to arrive in 18 months' time. And that, especially in renewable energy, that's really important because you have time slots where you need to get your project, your energy project plugged into the grid. Otherwise, you miss that slot and have to start again. And so if you do have a major delay of say like 12, 24 months, that can have like completely catastrophic impacts on whether or not that project can ever succeed or not.
And you've seen that?
Yeah.
Okay. What are the solar and wind customers, what are they trying to do to arbitrage the risk or manage the risk?
For like battery, solar, wind customers, the first thing they need to understand is like, what is our risk? Like, right now we're selecting between these suppliers. We're not experts in supply chain data, geopolitical risk, regulation risk, ESG risk. Like, firstly, I just need to understand, compared to, these 10 suppliers that I'm trying to select between, how do they compare to each other? And are there any that I like majorly need to intervene with, where they've got red flag risks that, for example, our project is very likely to be delayed, or that supplier is breaking modern slavery legislation, which means they're exposed to a 20 million pound fine. So that's the first kind of step, is like just understanding what are, for the suppliers that you're working with, how do they perform? How does their supply chain perform? And then the second step is then like, what can you do about it? So for example, like 75% of global battery production, according to our data, is connected with a forced labor incident at some point in a supply chain. So it's like a hugely pervasive problem, which means that it's very difficult to find those suppliers that we don't find any sort of forced labor risk associated with. And so then the question of like, what can you do about it? Like, we still need to deploy renewable energy at scale. And so it's then, okay, identify this risk, but then work with the supplier to address and to mitigate the risk. And so that's where, like at Infyos, our platform both highlights the performance of the suppliers, but then auto generates actions for the supplier to take with the customer in order to solve any of those low performance areas. And so that they can continue to win the contract, work together, but also solve kind of financial risk that's connected to both the customer that's saying, I want to do this due diligence, but also to the supplier themselves and for other contracts that the supplier might be winning.
So you're using market forces, which could have the effect of significantly reducing forced labour. And it sounds to me like you're hearing demand from the customers that they want to know. They don't just want to remain in blissful ignorance. They actually want to know because of the potential penalties.
Yeah, you've got this huge like swathe of regulation that's come into place, like US Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which overnight banned the majority of the world's largest solar manufacturers a couple of years ago, and as of last year put battery into the high risk category. And we see the implications of that starting to come into effect this year. Then you have in Europe things like the European battery regulation that mandates you have to have this supply chain data and supply chain risk systems in place. And then, so that's kind of one bucket that's moving things along. But then the other reality is these companies need access to financing in order to set up these projects. And the financing is now coming in with stringent requirements around, you need to have the supply chain data, you need to have these supply chain systems. And then on top of that, you just have, okay, how do we manage the financial performance of this project, which is make sure we're picking suppliers that can deliver on time, that aren't going to end up with delays that cost the project either like money in terms of penalties or money in terms of things aren't being delivered on time. They're losing out on revenue by not being able to plug it into the grid when they expected.
So we've got a case of an elected government has enacted policy which drives regulation and a direction of travel, and then markets can then react to those policies, and actually practically solve the problem. So that's a chain of all these different sectors of our economies working in tandem to hopefully solve some significant problems and make it so everybody wins, which I really like the sound of. So, things like, that policy's come into play. We've already said by 2030, we're going to triple the number of batteries or whatever it was. Where do you see energy storage and critical materials supply chain? Where do you see that space being in 2035?
I think if you look at what's important is that by 2035, pretty much all Western economies should be majority powered by renewable energy. That means that there's going to be a lot of pressure on these supply chains and the critical materials in the next 10 years. And so by 2035, we have to end up in a world where these supply chains are a lot more mature, they're a lot more predictable, and they're a lot more sustainable if we're going to be able to meet this expected demand for where the world is on renewable energy in 10 years' time.
And let's change tack here a little bit. And I'm curious about your journey with Infyos as well. I'd love to hear what's been a champagne moment where it was like take the win, but also what's been a squeaky bum moment. I'm sure there's been 100, but
Yeah, I think this is a challenge, right? Is like you kind of just get used to riding through all of it as like as the lows you end up figuring out like, okay, how do you make sure you don't end up in any major lows, because that will just kind of like derail your mindset. How do you always give yourself like optionality when things don't exactly go to plan? So when a customer, like, rather than saying like we need this one customer to work for our financial plan to work for the year, you're like, okay, how do we make sure we always have a sales pipeline that means we're never really dependent on like this one customer? And then same when you're fundraising, like how do you maintain multiple different options of exactly who you want to fundraise from, how you'll fundraise, and so on. And then I would say likewise on the champagne moment, I think it's probably one of the things that we are worst at as founders, is actually celebrating when things go to plan, because then you're constantly like, hey, we've done that, okay, cool, let's like move on, and now we have to do this other thing. Or you're just constantly spinning 10 different plates at the same time, which then means that you celebrate one win, but in your head you've got like 90% of your brain thinking about all these other things that still need to get done. So yeah, this is one thing that me and Tony are very conscious of, is that we probably need to get a bit better at being like, let's stop and realize how good things are going.
I really recommend that. How has it been co-founding with Tony? How did you guys meet? And yeah, how has it been being in a co-founding team? Any advice for other co-founders?
Yeah. So we obviously, part of the reason we're now speaking with you is that we met on Carbon13, which we were very much in the camp of like, both of us wanted to find the right co-founder over like be super set on an idea and then find co-founders willing to work around that idea. I think the great thing about me and Tony is, from a values perspective, we're very much similar to each other. So we were both like, we want to build a very similar kind of startup. Like we want it to be scaling as quickly as possible, have as much impact as possible, build a culture where people love coming to work every day, will work very hard, but will like genuinely enjoy work and also have a life outside of work. And at the same time, we're like this weird mix of personality wise, where can be laid back when we want to be, but also can be very much like go, go, go. We need to get all this stuff done. Like this is crunch time. And so in Carbon13, we spent a lot of time before we were like, yes, we're going to co-found, just like figuring exactly all of that out. I think we did the 50 founders questions or something like that it's called. And like, effectively went into like, what is the psyche of both of us, and are we the right match for each other? But then I think it's also like a constant thing that we're building on, in the sense that like every Monday morning we go for breakfast with each other. We like debrief what's the biggest things that's been on our plate over the weekend that we haven't been able to like get off of our chest, and kind of talk that through fresh on a Monday morning. And then in day to day, very much going backwards and forwards with each other of like, this is what the plan is. Do we agree this is the right plan? If someone doesn't agree this is the right plan, like having a discussion about that and figuring it out and moving on, but kind of all coming from a place of like, we want to build the best startup possible. It's not really about each of us individually caring about winning or losing. It's like, how do we collectively figure this thing out together?
When you say build the best startup possible, what's the mountain that you're going to climb? What's the ambition for Infyos?
Like for Infyos, we want to build something that completely changes the energy and mobility industry that we work in, and that we can like look back and say like, okay, part of the reason the renewable energy transition happened at the speed and scale it did was because we existed. That's like the level of ambition that we want to have, is like we really feel like we can leave a legacy in the industry we're working in. But also like day to day, you're just grinding it out, right? We're not really thinking about the scale. That's like the kind of step back moment. We're just thinking about, okay, what do we need to do this month? What do we need to do for the next 6 months to make this really work?
Exactly. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Yeah.
Would you say, last question, and I asked this of our founder guests, would you say Infyos is a climate tech company?
I think it's funny. I think when we were in Carbon13, we would have said, yeah, 100%. You know, we joined Carbon13 because like we as founders really care about climate net zero. And so of course we're going to build a climate tech company. I think as we build it and as we scale and as we get more and more customers on board in like the energy and mobility space, what we realize is like, on one hand, yes, that's still true. Yes, we like deeply care about climate, and fundamentally, the more customers we get on board, the more we're accelerating the transition to net zero. So it is happening. But also, when it comes to like the day to day of how do you sell to customers, and also how do we fundraise, we need to prove that this like has financial returns. So it has financial returns for our customers where they can avoid like hundreds of millions of pounds of costs on their supply chain and improve their profitability. And it has the same from a financial returns for the startup we're building. You know, the decision to be VC backed startup means that we are choosing the path of like, we are going to prove that financial returns works. And so far that's working. And so I think it's, yes, we're a climate tech company, but also I think we're a company at the core, and climate tech is kind of one piece of that. And I think especially in a world now that's very polarized around the concept of climate, I think it's even more important that you're thoughtful about how, or we're thoughtful about how we position ourselves. Yeah, like a great example is in the US market, we're much more positioned around supply chain risk from a geopolitical and a regulation point of view than we are from a kind of ESG human rights point of view. That's much more the conversation with European customers, because there's a lot more of the customer demand and regulation demand coming from these ESG associated regulations. And so you kind of just need to be aware of like, in the given circumstance and what you're trying to achieve for that 6 months, what do you need to build, but also not letting go of the like core mission of ours at the end of the day is, yes, we want to scale and have as much climate impact as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sarah. For everybody listening, please follow Infyos's progress as they literally transform a global industry step by step. And I would encourage anybody who's interested in building a company or looking at mentoring or investing in a company, you're very welcome to reach out to the Carbon13 community. We're a friendly bunch. Sarah can attest to that. And I think when we look back on this episode, I think we can say climate takes critical materials. It takes cobalt, lithium, just to name 2 out of 15. It takes 10,000 suppliers, circumnavigating the globe several times. It takes China, and it's going to take you. So join our community. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Sarah.